If only he knew why his wife decided his father had suffered enough. The call came on a Tuesday evening, when the sky outside had turned the color of old ash. I was in Abuja for a work trip, finishing my reports, when my phone buzzed on the desk. I stared at the screen before picking up. It was my wife, Adaeze. She never called during trips unless it was important. I pressed the phone to my ear. Her voice was steady, almost too steady, like someone who had practiced the words before dialing. She told me my father had passed. She said it softly and slowly, the way a nurse speaks before delivering news they expect you already know. He passed peacefully, Emeka, she said. He was comfortable at the end. I stood up, heart hammering, legs already moving toward my bag. I asked what happened. She said his breathing had simply stopped. She said it was quiet. She said it was the way an old man deserved to go. But something in the pause that followed, that half-second of silence before she added, "Don't rush. The road is dangerous at night," sat wrong in my chest. Peacefully. The word echoed as I zipped my bag. I had heard it before from doctors and nurses, but this time it felt rehearsed, like a line written down and read aloud. I drove through the night anyway. By the time I reached our compound in Enugu, it was past 11 and the yard was already full of neighbors and relatives. Kerosene lanterns threw orange light across faces sitting in quiet clusters. Someone had draped a white cloth over the front door. The women inside were already singing the old hymns my father loved. I stepped through and the air hit me, thick with incense and the heaviness of a room that has held a body. My father had already been washed and wrapped in white linen. He lay on his mat, hands folded on his chest, face arranged into something that looked like rest. I stood over him for a long time, then I looked up and searched for Adaeze. She was near the back wall, receiving condolences from aunties patting her arms and calling her a good daughter-in-law. When she finally felt my eyes on her, she turned. For just a moment our gazes met. And then she looked away, not downward, away, like she was deliberately choosing a different direction to face. That was the first thing I noticed. My wife, who could look me in the eye through any storm we had weathered, would not meet my gaze the night my father died. The funeral was held 4 days later. Our compound had never felt so full. Chairs stretched in long rows under white canopies. Women from the church group sat together in blue and white wrappers, singing until their voices trembled. My father had been a respected retired headmaster, and the people came to honor that. The pastor gave a long sermon about the reward of the faithful. Then he paused and turned to where Adaeze sat. He smiled warmly and said the congregation wanted to recognize our daughter, Adaeze, who gave herself without reservation to care for our beloved headmaster in his final months. The crowd murmured in agreement. Someone near the back called out, "She is a woman of mercy." The word rippled forward and people nodded and clapped softly. Adaeze stood and bowed her head in gratitude. I watched her accept the praise with folded hands and downcast eyes, the picture of a humble woman. But I saw it, for just a fraction of a second. When the word mercy landed on her, her shoulders tightened. Her jaw moved, the faintest clench. Then she smoothed her expression back into something soft. Nobody else caught it. But I was her husband. I had spent 9 years learning the language of her body. Let me take you back to when this began. 8 months before my father died, his health had fallen sharply. He had been living alone since my mother passed 3 years earlier, and neighbors had started calling to say he was forgetting things, leaving the stove on, missing medications. One morning he wandered 3 streets away in his sleeping clothes and could not find his way back. After that, it was clear he could not stay alone. I was the first son. The responsibility was mine. When I brought the matter to Adaeze, I expected hesitation. The house was small. We had 2 children, our son Chidi, who was 8, and our daughter Nena, who was 6. There was no spare room, but Adaeze surprised me. She sat across from me and without any argument she said, "Bring him here." I was relieved. I reached across and held her hand. She said, "He is your father, Emeka. He should not be alone." She paused, looked down at the table, then added something quietly, almost to herself. Suffering is worse than death. I thought she meant it as a reason to bring him close so we could ease his pain. I did not think much of it then. Those words would return to me in a very different light. My father moved in during the first week of March. I had worried he would feel like a burden, the way old people sometimes sense they are being managed. But Adaeze made it easier than I imagined. She rearranged our back room into a proper bedroom for him, brought in a new mattress, and kept a small lamp burning through the night so he would not be afraid. She learned exactly how he liked his morning tea, which hymns he preferred, which side he favored when he slept. She bathed him on the days his hands shook too badly. She fed him when the tremors made the spoon difficult. She monitored his medications with precision the doctor even remarked on during visits. Neighbors talked about how devoted she was. My father seemed comfortable those first weeks. But I began to notice, as March moved into April, that he had grown quieter around her. Not in the peaceful way of a contented man. Quieter in the way of a man carefully choosing his words. Once, while I was reading nearby, he reached out and held my hand with both of his. He held it tight and opened his mouth as if to speak. I leaned in. He looked past me toward the doorway, and then, slowly, he closed his mouth again. It was a Saturday morning in late April when I noticed something unsettling. I came home early from errands to find Adaeze at the medication tray in my father's room, pressing 2 extra tablets out of the foil. My father's prescription was clear. I attended every doctor's visit. 2 tablets in the morning, 1 at night, but she was preparing 3 for the morning dose. I asked her about it. She turned with a calm expression. No guilt, no hesitation. Just an ease I now understand was more rehearsed than natural. She said the doctor had mentioned that dosage could be adjusted if his discomfort increased. She said he had been in more pain recently and that 3 helped ease him through the morning. She said it gently, and I told myself she was probably right. She was present every day. She knew his rhythms better than I did. I told myself that. But that night, sitting in the living room after everyone was asleep, I tried to remember exactly what the doctor had said at our last visit. I could not recall any mention of adjusting the dose. And across the hallway, my father did not sleep. I could hear him shifting on his mattress for hours, restless in the dark. I cannot pinpoint exactly when those words changed for me, but there was one evening in May I keep returning to. Adaeze did not know I was home. I had returned from work early and gone straight to my study. The door to my father's room was half open. I could hear her voice inside, soft and slow. I moved closer, staying to the side of the doorframe. She was sitting beside him, holding his hand, saying, "You have fought for so long, Papa. You have suffered long enough." My father said nothing. She continued, her voice like water. "Rest is not a bad thing. Rest is what you deserve." I stood in the hallway without moving. She must have heard my shadow shift because she glanced toward the door and saw me. Something startled beneath her calm for just a moment. Then she smiled and explained she was simply giving comfort, reminding him his pain would ease. She laughed softly and said old people needed to hear that suffering was not permanent. I nodded. I said nothing. But that night I dreamed of my father calling my name through a thick dark curtain. His voice muffled, as if something was pressing down on his chest and he was trying to breathe around it. I brought my unease to my uncle, my father's younger brother, on a Sunday visit. We sat outside under the mango tree while the children played nearby. I told him what I had noticed, the extra medication, the words she had said, the way my father had started reaching for my hand. My uncle listened, then leaned back and shook his head. He said I was overthinking. He said Adaeze had given herself completely to caring for my father and I should be grateful instead of suspicious. He said grief sometimes arrives before death and that my father's decline was affecting my judgment. I tried once more, mentioning the medication change. He waved his hand and said caregivers often adjust small things without needing a full discussion. He told me to trust my wife. I left feeling worse than before, with the particular loneliness of a worry that nobody will hold with you. But before I reached my car, My father's older sister, Aunt Chioma, who had been sitting quietly nearby, called out to me. She said it softly, as if she did not want others to hear. She said, "Emeka, listen carefully. Mercy given without a person's permission is a very dangerous thing." Then she turned and walked back inside without another word. July came like something slow and heavy. My father had grown thinner. His voice, which had once filled a classroom for 30 years, was now barely more than a whisper. He slept longer each day and woke with eyes looking at something far away. But there were brief, bright moments when he was completely himself. On one such morning, he grabbed my wrist with a grip that surprised me with its strength. His eyes were sharp and looking directly into mine. He said very quietly, "Don't leave me alone with her." I stared at him. He did not elaborate. He simply held my gaze and repeated it. "Don't leave me alone, Emeka." I told him I would not go anywhere. I told him he was safe. He relaxed his grip and nodded, and within minutes he was drifting back towards sleep. I sat with him the rest of that morning, my mind turning over what he had said. Had it been the confusion that comes with his condition? Or had he been telling me something real, something his weakened state made impossible to say more clearly? I wanted to believe it was confusion. I needed to believe it, because the alternative was something I was not yet ready to carry. 3 weeks later, my office called. There was a crisis at a construction site 2 states away, and my presence was urgently needed. I stood in the bedroom, phone in hand, staring at the calendar. I thought of my father's grip on my wrist. Adaeze sat on the edge of the bed, watching me. I told her about the trip. She nodded and said, "Go. Your father is stable. I have everything under control." I said I could send a colleague instead. She said nonsense, it was my project. I hesitated and she came over and touched my arm and said, "Emeka, I care for him every single day. Nothing will happen." I asked if my aunt could come stay. Adaze's expression did not change, but something shifted behind her eyes, small and quick. She said my aunt would upset his routine. She said 2 days was nothing. I carried my bag to the car slowly. I helped Chitty and Nena in with their school bags. I turned before getting in and looked back at the front door. Adaeze was standing in the frame watching us leave. She did not wave. She did not call out. She simply watched in silence until we turned out of the compound and she disappeared from my mirror. I do not know exactly what happened in that house after we left. What I have pieced together comes from things Adaeze said afterward and one detail the doctor noted when he arrived after the fact. My father's breathing had been difficult that day. The neighbor across the road heard the television playing in the living room for most of the afternoon. But by evening, Adaeze had gone back into his room and closed the door. What happened after that door closed, in the quiet hour before my phone rang, I can only imagine. The imagining is the worst part. I know my father was afraid. I know he had asked me not to leave him. I know that whatever decision was made in that room was made by one person alone, without his voice, without his agreement, without anyone to speak for what he actually wanted in that final hour. Adaeze said later that he was in tremendous pain. She said she held his hand and spoke to him about rest. She said his breathing grew slower and then stopped. She said it was quiet. She said he was at peace. And every time I replay those words, I hear the calm in her voice and wonder how long she had been preparing them. The phone rang at 9:47 in the evening. I was in my hotel room, barely touching the takeaway on my desk. I saw her name on the screen and knew before I answered. She said, "Emeka, your father is gone." Her voice was composed, every word placed carefully. I asked if she had called the doctor. There was a pause. She said she had called the family first. I told her to call the doctor immediately. I called my uncle right after and told him to go to the house. When he arrived, he called to say the room had been straightened. The medication tray had been cleared and put away. The sheets had been changed. My father lay in fresh linen, looking, my uncle said, very peaceful. The doctor came eventually and recorded the death as natural, consistent with my father's condition. An old, ill man had passed in his sleep. Nothing on the surface suggested otherwise. I drove back the following morning. The entire way, I could not stop thinking about the order of things. The room cleaned before the doctor arrived. The sheets changed. The tray put away. These are not the actions of someone who discovered a body. These are the actions of someone preparing a scene. That thought did not leave me. A year passed in uneven pieces, some weeks heavy, some days almost light. I returned to work. The children returned to school. We sat at the dinner table each evening and talked about ordinary things. Adaeze cooked my father's favorite soup on the anniversary of his birth, saying it was to honor his memory. I watched her when she did not know I was watching, trying to read something in her face that would confirm my fear or dissolve it. I found neither. She was the same woman I had married, warm and capable and steady. She helped Nena with homework. She laughed at my half-funny jokes. She slept beside me each night without apparent weight. One Sunday afternoon, I found myself humming the hymn my father used to sing while working in his garden. I did not notice until the tears came. Adaeze heard me from the kitchen and came to stand in the doorway. She looked at me for a moment. Then she smiled. It was a small, private smile, not a sad one, not the smile of someone mourning alongside me. It was something else entirely, something I could not name in that moment. But I stored it quietly in the growing collection of things about my wife that I no longer fully understood. It happened on an ordinary Saturday. The children were at a neighbor's birthday party, and the house was quiet in the way I had never gotten comfortable with since my father died. Adaeze and I were at the dining table after lunch, each with a cup of tea, not saying much. She had been reflective all morning, speaking less, watching more. Then she set her cup down and said, "You seem lighter these days, Emeka." I said I supposed I was adjusting. She nodded. Then she said, "You should be happy now. He is no longer suffering." I looked at her. She held my gaze steadily. I said it was a comfort to know he was at rest. She nodded, and then said something that stopped my breathing. She said, "I did what was right, Emeka." She said it quietly, matter-of-factly, the way someone states a thing they arrived at with full certainty long ago. She was not asking for my opinion or seeking reassurance. She was simply stating a fact already settled within herself. I put my cup down slowly. The table between us suddenly felt very wide. I asked her, keeping my voice as steady as I could, what exactly she meant by that. She did not look away. She did not flinch or soften what she was about to say. She began in that measured voice she used when she had thought something through completely. She told me about the day I left. She said his breathing had been very bad, worse than in weeks. He had cried out twice in pain, and watching him had been unbearable. She said she looked at this man, reduced to a body fighting against itself, and made a decision. I asked what decision. She told me. She had increased his medication far beyond the prescribed dose, and after some time, his breathing grew slow and then quiet. She said it clearly, without drama or tears. She had held his hand until the end. Then she looked at me and said, "It was an act of love, Emeka. I ended his suffering." I sat completely still. The room was very quiet. Outside, a car passed slowly on the road. She folded her hands on the table and waited. I had no words. Because the thing she was describing, the thing she called love, was the very thing I had feared for months and told myself was impossible. Told myself I was imagining. Told myself only a troubled mind would suspect. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the study until past 3 in the morning, moving through emotions with no clean names. Horror was there. A different kind of grief, separate from what I had carried for a year, was there. Anger came and went in waves. Underneath all of it was something almost worse. A heavy guilt, because I had known something was wrong and I had left anyway. I had heard my father say, "Don't leave me alone with her," and I told myself it was confusion. I had gone on that work trip and left him. In the morning, I told Adaeze calmly she needed to go and stay with her parents. I said I needed time to think. She did not argue. She packed a bag quietly, kissed the children's foreheads while they slept, and left before breakfast. Chitty woke and asked where Mama was. I told him she had gone to see Grandma. He accepted this and asked for cornflakes. I made his breakfast, sat across from him, watched him eat, and tried to hold myself together. By noon I had called my uncle and told him everything. The silence on the line lasted a very long time before he finally found words. Adaeze's parents came to see me 4 days later. Her father in his good agbada, her mother in a pressed wrapper, both carrying the look of people who had not slept well. Her father spoke first. He said what Adaeze had done was wrong by the laws of God and man. He said it clearly and with evident pain. Her mother wept silently into a handkerchief. They did not minimize what had happened. But then her father leaned forward and said she was still their daughter, still my wife, still the mother of my children. He said she had done something terrible out of a belief that she was doing good, and this distinction, he admitted, did not change what had been done, but it changed what we were dealing with. Her mother reached out and touched my hand. She said, "Emeka, will you destroy your family to punish what cannot be undone?" I said nothing. I was not ready to answer, because I was asking myself a version of the same question. What does a man do with a truth this large? What does justice look like when the one who caused the harm did it believing, completely and without doubt, that they were expressing love? I sought out Elder Boniface, one of the most respected men in our community, someone who had counseled our family through many difficulties. He lived at the edge of town, surrounded by a garden he had tended for 40 years. We sat outside and I told him everything. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he was quiet for a while, watching the leaves in the afternoon breeze. Then he said something I have turned over many times since. He said, "Emeka, mercy chosen alone becomes blood." He said true mercy requires the voice of the person suffering. Without that voice, without permission, mercy becomes something the giver uses to feel righteous while the one receiving it has no say. He said my wife had taken away the one thing every person is owed at the end of life, the right to face that ending on their own terms. Then he looked at me and said, "Truth is heavier than peace, but silence carried too long becomes a sickness." He said I had a choice to make and I needed to choose fully, not halfway. He urged me not to let the truth disappear simply because managing it was complicated. He said the comfortable choice was not always the righteous one. I went to see Adaeze at her parents' house 2 weeks after I sent her away. We sat in a small room off the main parlor. I told her I needed to hear how she had arrived at the decision she made. She began to speak. She said that years before we met, she had watched her grandfather die over several months from a disease that caused constant pain. She had sat with him during his final weeks and seen what prolonged suffering looked like. She said she had read about countries where ending terminal suffering with medical help was considered an act of compassion. She had quietly carried this idea for years. When she saw my father suffering in those final weeks, ending it had felt like the obvious thing to do. She truly believed she had spared him pain. She felt no guilt. That was the part that stayed with me most. Not the act, not even the deception, but the complete absence of guilt. She looked at me calmly and said, "If I were in the same situation, I would want someone to do the same for me." I looked at her and thought, quietly and with great sadness, "But you did not ask him. You decided for him, and that is the difference everything rests on." I made the mistake of telling one cousin, who told another, and within 10 days the story had moved through the family like smoke. Reactions split sharply. Some people, mostly younger ones, argued that Adaeze had done something understandable, even brave, that watching someone suffer when you have the means to end it is its own cruelty. One cousin sent me a long message about dignity in dying and called me unforgiving. Others, particularly the elders, were deeply shaken. 2 of my father's sisters could not eat for a day when they heard. One called it an abomination. She said there were things that belonged to God alone. My uncle, who had initially told me I was overthinking, was now barely able to speak when the subject came up. Somewhere beneath all the opinions and noise, the question of the law began to surface. Someone used the word police. Another mentioned investigation. Adaeze's family called urgently, begging me not to go to the authorities. My own family was divided on what I owed the truth. I sat in the middle of all of it, feeling the weight of a decision I had not yet made but that everyone was waiting for me to make. The pressure from every direction was immense. There were 3 days in October when I almost let it go. The children had been asking for their mother. Nena had started having trouble sleeping and came to my bed in the night, pressing herself against my side like she used to as a toddler. Chitty had become quieter in a way that reminded me of how my father had grown quiet. I sat on the edge of Nena's bed one evening, stroking her hair after she finally fell asleep, and I thought about what rebuilding might look like. Adaeze coming home, the children having their mother at the breakfast table. The ordinary rhythms of a life not cracked open by all of this. I nearly convinced myself it was possible to absorb what had happened and continue. That the damage done by pursuing justice might outweigh the wrong already committed. I was almost there. I had nearly sealed the decision in my mind. And then I remembered the morning in July. I remembered my father's grip on my wrist. I remembered the clarity in his eyes. I remembered exactly what he said. And I understood that if I let this go, I would be failing him a second time. I was not sure I could live with that. I went back to Elder Boniface. I sat with him in his garden and told him where I was. He listened. When I finished, he asked a question I was not expecting. He said, "Emeka, who decides when another person's suffering is finished?" I sat with that question before speaking. He did not rush me. I said the person suffering is the only one with that right. He nodded. He said, "Then you already know what the real crime was." He said the real crime was that my father's voice had been removed from the most important moment of his life. He had not been asked. He had not been given the chance to say yes or no. Someone had decided for him, with love in their heart, that his story was finished. That, Elder Boniface said quietly, is something no amount of love gives a person the right to do. I drove home in silence. I did not turn on the radio. I sat in my driveway for a long time, hands on the steering wheel, looking at the front door of the house my father had come to live in and had left from in a white sheet. When I went inside, I already knew what I was going to do. I drove to Adaeze's parents' house on a Thursday morning. She met me in the same small room. She was dressed neatly, her expression composed as always. I sat across from her and said I had spent a long time thinking and needed her to understand where I had arrived. I told her I did not believe she had acted out of cruelty. I believed she had acted from a sincere conviction that she was doing something kind. But I told her that my father had asked me not to leave him alone with her, that he had been afraid, and that this meant he had not wanted what she decided for him. His fear mattered more than her certainty. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, quietly and without hesitation, "If I had to make the same choice again, I would make it." I looked at her for a long time. I thought about 9 years of marriage. I thought about Chitty's laugh and Nena's small hands. I thought about my father's grip on my wrist, that strong, desperate grip, and the clarity in his eyes. I stood up. I said I was sorry. And then I turned and walked out of that room. The truth came out fully over the weeks that followed. I spoke to the authorities not in anger, but because Elder Boniface had been right. Silence carried too long becomes a sickness. The investigation was long and hard on everyone involved. Adaeze's family was devastated. My children struggled with things too large for their ages. The community, which had praised her as a woman of mercy, now processed a far more complicated story. The legal outcome was not simple, as it rarely is in situations that exist in the difficult space between love and law. But the truth was recorded. My father's death was named correctly. His story was given the dignity of being told honestly. The community did not arrive at easy consensus. Some continued to believe Adaeze had acted out of compassion. Others could not forgive what had been done. But the debate was now rooted in truth rather than a version of events arranged in a clean room before the doctor arrived. Adaeze received consequences that were neither as severe as some demanded nor as lenient as her family hoped. Silence eventually settled where the arguing had been. Not peace exactly, but honest silence, which is different from the silence that hides things, and that difference matters more than I can easily explain. I still sit with my father sometimes the way you sit with people who are gone. I go to the back room that was his, now empty, the small lamp on the bedside table because I cannot move it. I think about what he would say to me now. I believe he would say I did the right thing, though it cost more than I knew I had. He would also tell me not to carry too much guilt. I know that is what I do. I went on a work trip when he asked me not to leave him. I ignored the signs longer than I should have. I told myself the fear in his eyes was confusion. These things will live in me for a long time. But if there is one lesson to carry forward, it is what Elder Boniface said, which I will teach my son and daughter when they are old enough. Compassion is not a gift you give someone without their knowledge. Love does not mean knowing better than the person suffering what they need. True mercy begins with asking. My father deserved to be asked. He deserved the chance to speak for himself at the end of his life. If only she had known that love without permission is not love at all.